Nobody in Ashenvale ever found Calla Rivers again, though King Draven Ashen spent 11 years searching every border, every allied territory, every rumor of a healer with storm-colored eyes and a child who couldn't quite explain why he sometimes shifted before the proper age. She'd vanished the same week the palace physicians confirmed her pregnancy, slipping past the royal guard in the dead of night with nothing but a satchel of herbs, a stolen cloak, and a truth so dangerous that staying meant certain death for both her and the child she carried. Draven had loved her. That was never the question anyone in his court dared ask aloud, not after the fury he'd shown in the weeks following her disappearance, tearing through the kingdom's every corner searching for a woman his own council insisted had simply run from the burden of carrying a king's heir. What his council never told him, what only 3 people in the entire kingdom knew, was that Calla hadn't run from him at all. She'd run from his mother. 11 years later, a border healer in a territory that didn't officially exist on any Ashenvale map treated a wounded traveling merchant, and something about the boy standing quietly beside her, holding her medical supplies with practiced, careful hands, made the merchant go very still. Storm-gray eyes. A faint, unmistakable scar behind his left ear, shaped exactly like the Ashen royal crest. The merchant left that village within the hour, riding hard for the capital with news that would finally, after 11 years, bring King Draven Ashen face to face with everything his own family had spent over a decade desperately trying to keep him from ever discovering. Ashenvale had been ruled by the same bloodline for 11 generations, a kingdom whose stability rested, according to centuries of carefully guarded tradition, on an unbroken chain of alpha succession that had never once been disrupted by scandal, illegitimacy, or any hint of weakness in the royal line. Queen Mother Isabeau Ashen had devoted her entire life to protecting that unbroken tradition, first as a young queen navigating her own husband's difficult reign, and later, following his death, as the fiercely protective mother of a young king she'd raised to understand, above all else, that Ashenvale's survival depended entirely on the throne's perceived, unassailable strength. She'd approved of Calla Rivers initially, a talented healer whose medical skill had saved Draven's life during a border skirmish in the early months of his reign, and whose subsequent mate bond with her son seemed, at first, a fortunate confirmation of the moon's continued blessing over the Ashen line. Her approval curdled into calculated hostility the moment Calla's pregnancy was confirmed, and Isabeau's own physicians, conducting the routine early examinations tradition required for any potential royal heir, discovered something considerably more troubling than a simple confirmation of the child's viability. Calla Rivers carried, hidden within her own bloodline, a genetic marker the Ashen physicians recognized with dawning horror, proof, buried for 3 generations within her maternal line, that she descended from the Thornwood family, exiled from Ashenvale a century earlier following a failed rebellion that had nearly toppled the Ashen throne entirely. A child born from that union, Isabeau understood immediately, would carry blood from both the ruling Ashen line and the very rebel bloodline that tradition insisted could never again be permitted near the throne, a genetic reality that, should it ever become public knowledge, threatened to unravel 11 generations of carefully maintained succession legitimacy. Isabeau made her decision within days of receiving the physician's report, understanding with cold, calculated clarity that her son, blinded by genuine love for Calla, would never willingly choose the kingdom's stability over his own mate bond if given the actual truth to consider. She never gave him the choice. Instead, she summoned Calla privately, presented her with the physician's findings, and made clear, in terms that left no room for negotiation, exactly what continuing the pregnancy within Ashenvale's borders would ultimately require. Not simply Calla's own exile, but the child's permanent removal from any claim to Draven's affection or protection. Raised in secret isolation to ensure the rebel bloodline's taint could never threaten the throne's legitimacy. Calla chose, instead, to disappear entirely, protecting both herself and her unborn child from a fate Isabeau's calculated threat made unmistakably clear, vanishing into the night before Isabeau's plan could be properly implemented, taking with her a truth that would remain buried for the next 11 years. Calla Rivers stood frozen in the Queen Mother's private receiving chamber, staring at documents that confirmed, in careful, damning medical detail, exactly why Isabeau Ashen had summoned her alone, without Draven's knowledge, on a gray autumn afternoon 3 weeks after the royal physicians had confirmed her pregnancy. "The Thornwood bloodline," Isabeau said, her voice carrying the particular cold precision Calla had learned, over 8 months of careful courtship with Draven, to recognize as genuinely dangerous. "Buried 3 generations deep in your maternal line, but unmistakably present. Your grandmother, it appears, changed her family name rather thoroughly before settling in the eastern provinces." "I didn't know," Calla said, the words barely making it past the shock constricting her throat. "I swear to you, Your Majesty, I had no idea my family carried any connection to." "Your ignorance doesn't change the reality of what you're carrying," Isabeau interrupted, gesturing toward the medical documents with a coldness that made Calla's chest tighten with dawning, horrified understanding. "A child born from your bond with my son would carry Thornwood blood alongside the Ashen line, blood this kingdom's entire nobility has spent a century believing permanently, safely excised from any possible claim to succession." "Draven loves me," Calla said, desperation entering her voice despite her best efforts at composure. "Whatever concerns exist regarding my bloodline, surely he deserves the chance to understand and address them properly, rather than—" "My son," Isabeau said, "would choose you regardless of the political catastrophe that choice would ultimately invite. That is precisely why I cannot allow him the opportunity to make that choice at all." The threat, delivered with devastating clarity over the following minutes, left Calla no genuine room for negotiation. Isabeau intended to formally expose the Thornwood connection to Ashen Vale's full council, framing Calla's pregnancy as a calculated rebel infiltration rather than genuine, innocent love, a framing that would result, Isabeau made unmistakably clear, in Calla's execution for treason and the child's permanent removal to a secret location where its dangerous bloodline could never threaten the throne's legitimacy. "There is another option," Isabeau said finally, watching Calla's devastated comprehension with something that might have been genuine, if calculated, mercy. "Leave Ashenvale tonight, before this becomes formal council business. Take the child somewhere beyond this kingdom's reach, somewhere the Thornwood connection can never be traced back to my son's throne. I will personally ensure no formal search parties pursue you beyond what basic protocol requires, provided you never attempt contact with Draven or this kingdom again." "You're asking me to simply disappear," Calla said, grief and fury tangling together as the full weight of Isabeau's calculated ultimatum settled fully into focus. "To let him believe I abandoned him, rather than telling him the truth about what you're actually threatening." "I'm offering you and your child's survival," Isabeau said, "in exchange for my son's throne remaining secure. I would suggest, Lady Rivers, that you consider very carefully exactly how much genuine choice this situation actually affords either of us." Calla left the chamber that evening with a decision already devastatingly made, not because Isabeau's threat had fully convinced her of its necessity, but because she understood, with growing horror, that whatever choice she made now would determine not just her own fate, but her unborn child's entire future. She packed a small satchel of essential herbs and supplies that same night and disappeared from Ashen Vale's palace before the sun had fully risen the following morning. Draven discovered Calla's disappearance at dawn, when her chambers proved empty and her personal healer supplies, always meticulously organized, had vanished alongside her. "She's gone," he told his mother, storming into her private receiving chamber with a desperate urgency that Isabeau met with carefully practiced, sorrowful composure. Cala's chambers are empty. No note, no explanation. Simply gone. "I'm so sorry, my son," Isabeau said, her performance of genuine grief so convincing that Draven, consumed by his own devastating shock, never once suspected the calculated deception underlying her sympathetic response. "I know how much she meant to you. We need to organize search parties immediately," Draven said, already moving toward the door before his mother's careful, restraining hand caught his arm. "Draven." Isabeau's voice carried a gentle, sorrowful warning that stopped him despite his desperate urgency. "I understand your devastation, but I feel compelled, as your mother, to share something I've been reluctant to burden you with, given how genuinely happy your bond with Cala appeared to make you." "What are you talking about?" "I've had some concerns, these past weeks, regarding certain inconsistencies in Lady Rivers's background," Isabeau said, weaving her calculated fiction with practiced, devastating precision. "Nothing I felt warranted alarming you directly until now. But her sudden disappearance, immediately following confirmation of her pregnancy, suggests a pattern I fear may indicate she never intended genuine, permanent commitment to this bond in the first place." The suggestion, delivered with careful, maternal concern, planted a seed of devastating doubt that would, over the following months, gradually poison Draven's genuine grief with corrosive uncertainty regarding exactly what had actually motivated Cala's sudden, inexplicable departure. "You believe she simply used our bond," Draven said slowly, and abandoned it once she understood the genuine weight of carrying a royal heir. "I believe," Isabeau said carefully, "that grief makes it difficult to consider painful possibilities objectively. I would encourage you to organize appropriate search efforts, certainly, but I would also encourage you to prepare yourself for the possibility that Lady Rivers's disappearance may reflect her own choice, rather than any misfortune requiring your rescue." The search parties Draven organized in the following weeks searched extensively throughout Ashenvale's territory and several neighboring kingdoms, though Isabeau, working carefully behind the scenes, ensured those searches consistently avoided the specific border territories where her own quietly arranged intelligence suggested Cala had actually fled. Draven spent months in increasingly desperate, grief-stricken searching, his mother's carefully planted doubt regarding Cala's genuine motivations gradually, corrosively transforming his devastating loss into something considerably more complicated, grief tangled with a growing, unwelcome suspicion that perhaps Cala had genuinely chosen to abandon both him and their unborn child, rather than facing some external danger that might have justified her sudden, inexplicable disappearance. It would take 11 years, and evidence Isabeau had never anticipated surviving her careful manipulation, before Draven finally understood exactly how thoroughly his own mother had orchestrated every devastating moment of what he'd spent over a decade believing was simply Cala's personal betrayal. Cala found refuge, eventually, in a small border settlement called Hollow Creek, a village so remote and so carefully positioned outside any kingdom's formal territorial claims that it existed, functionally, entirely off official maps, populated primarily by exiles, deserters, and others who'd found reason, over generations, to disappear from whatever formal governance structures might otherwise have claimed them. She arrived 7 months pregnant, exhausted from weeks of careful, evasive travel, and found the village's aging healer, an elderly woman named Petra, willing to offer both shelter and eventual medical partnership in exchange for Cala's own considerable healing skill. "You're running from something," Petra observed, within days of Cala's arrival, watching her flinch at the sound of unfamiliar hoofbeats approaching the village's outer perimeter. "I won't ask what, unless you're inclined to share it yourself." Hollow Creek has never much cared about anyone's history, provided they're willing to contribute honestly to the village's continued survival. I'd rather not discuss the details, Calla said, genuine gratitude evident beneath her careful, protective caution. Simply understand that my child's safety requires considerable discretion regarding our presence here. Understood, Petra said simply, and true to her word, never pressed further throughout the following months of Calla's continued residence within the village. Calla gave birth to a son in the depths of winter, delivered by Petra's careful, experienced hands in a small cottage at Hollow Creek's edge, far removed from any of the formal royal ceremony that would have traditionally accompanied an Ashen heir's birth. She named him Corin, choosing a name entirely disconnected from either the Ashen or Thornwood bloodlines, a deliberate, careful erasure of any obvious connection to the devastating political circumstances that had driven her into this remote, isolated exile. The scar behind his left ear, a birthmark, Calla understood with quiet, devastating recognition, unique to the Ashen royal bloodline for as long as recorded history documented, remained the single, unmistakable physical proof of exactly whose child she'd actually borne, regardless of how thoroughly she'd otherwise attempted to erase any connection to his true heritage. She kept him carefully hidden from outside visitors throughout his early childhood, training him gradually, as he grew old enough to understand, in the careful discretion their continued safety required. "Why can't I tell people about my scar?" Corin asked once, around his 6th birthday, curious in the uncomplicated way of a child who understood little of the actual danger underlying his mother's careful caution. "Some things are simply private, sweetheart," Calla told him, the explanation she'd carefully rehearsed for exactly this inevitable question. "Not everything about ourselves needs to be shared with strangers." He accepted the explanation with a child's uncomplicated trust, never fully understanding, throughout his early years, exactly how much devastating history and calculated danger lay hidden beneath his mother's careful, protective evasions. It would take another 5 years before that carefully maintained secrecy finally, inevitably began unraveling. Corin's first uncontrolled shift occurred 3 days before his 11th birthday, considerably earlier than the traditional age most Lycan children began developing their transformative abilities, a detail that sent Calla into immediate, devastating alarm the moment she witnessed her son's small human form suddenly, involuntarily shifting into an equally small silver-gray wolf shape during an otherwise ordinary afternoon in Hollow Creek's forest clearing. "That's not supposed to happen yet," Petra observed, watching the transformation with genuine, scientific curiosity rather than alarm, though Calla's own reaction suggested considerably more devastating implications than simple biological anomaly. Most Lycan children don't manage their first shift until at least 13, sometimes considerably later. "He's Ashen bloodline," Calla admitted, finally, after 11 years of careful, protective secrecy, the words tearing loose with a desperate need to finally share the devastating weight she'd carried entirely alone throughout her son's early childhood. The royal line's abilities have always developed earlier than typical Lycan children. "I should have anticipated this happening eventually." Petra absorbed this revelation with visible shock, understanding suddenly, with growing clarity, exactly what kind of devastating political danger her quiet border village had unknowingly been sheltering for over a decade. "Ashen Vale's royal line," she repeated slowly. "Calla, do you understand what kind of danger that connection could bring, should the wrong people ever discover it?" "I understand better than anyone," Calla said, old grief and exhausted, protective fear evident in equal measure. "I've spent 11 years ensuring exactly that discovery never happens. But early shifting abilities are difficult to fully hide, Petra. He's going to need considerably more careful guidance managing this ability than I've required from him thus far." The following weeks brought careful, urgent training, Calla teaching Corin control techniques she'd learned, years earlier, from Ashenvale's own royal instructors during her brief courtship with Draven, techniques she'd never anticipated needing to teach her own child, given how thoroughly she'd hoped their permanent exile might have severed any genuine connection to his true heritage's dangerous political weight. "Why do I shift differently than the other village children?" Corin asked, increasingly curious as his own abilities continued developing with unusual speed and precision throughout the following months. "You come from a particularly strong bloodline," Calla told him, offering careful, partial truth rather than the full, devastating reality she still hoped to shield him from for as long as genuinely possible. "It simply means your abilities develop somewhat differently than most." He accepted this explanation with growing, though not yet fully satisfied, curiosity, old enough now to sense the careful evasion underlying his mother's explanations, though not yet insistent enough to demand considerably more complete answers than she remained willing to offer. It was 6 months later, during an ordinary afternoon treating a wounded traveling merchant passing through Hollow Creek's remote territory, that Calla's 11 years of careful, protective secrecy finally, catastrophically began unraveling entirely. The merchant arrived at Hollow Creek with a badly infected sword wound sustained during a bandit ambush along the border territory's more dangerous eastern passages, seeking whatever medical assistance the remote village might offer to travelers desperate enough to risk its uncertain, off-map location. Calla treated the wound with practiced, efficient skill, Corin assisting as he'd learned to do throughout years of helping his mother's medical practice, carefully organizing supplies and offering steady, reassuring presence to patients frightened by their injury's severity. The merchant, recovering slowly over several days of careful treatment, found himself increasingly curious about the quiet, capable boy assisting Calla's medical work with such practiced, unusual precision for someone apparently no older than 11 or 12. "You've got a keen eye for medicine, young man," he observed one afternoon, watching Corin carefully measure herbal compounds with a precision that suggested years of dedicated practice. "Your mother's trained you well. She says I've got a natural gift for it," Corin said, with the uncomplicated pride of a child genuinely proud of skills he'd worked hard to develop. It was reaching for a particular herb bundle, several days into his recovery, that the merchant first noticed the faint scar behind Corin's left ear, barely visible beneath his dark hair, but unmistakable once properly observed, its distinctive crescent shape matching, with devastating precision, the royal ashen crest the merchant had encountered countless times throughout years of legitimate trade dealings with Ashenvale's palace. He went very still, studying the boy with sudden, careful attention that Corin, absorbed in his careful herbal work, entirely failed to notice. "That's an unusual scar," the merchant said carefully, keeping his voice deliberately casual despite the sudden, racing calculation now unfolding behind his careful observation. "How did you come by it?" "I don't really remember," Corin said honestly. "Mom says I've had it since I was a baby. Some kind of birthmark, I think, though it looks kind of like a scar." The merchant said nothing further, though his careful, calculating attention toward both Corin and Calla intensified considerably throughout the remainder of his recovery, gathering additional, subtle observations that gradually, with growing certainty, confirmed exactly what devastating discovery he suspected he'd stumbled upon entirely by accident. He left Hollow Creek within the hour of his recovery being formally confirmed sufficient for safe travel, offering careful, grateful thanks for Calla's medical assistance, while giving no indication whatsoever of the devastating realization now driving his urgent, immediate departure. He rode hard for Ashenvale's capital, understanding clearly that whatever reward King Draven might offer for information regarding his long-lost, presumed vanished mate and an heir nobody in the kingdom currently knew existed would considerably exceed whatever modest profit his original trading journey might have otherwise provided. The merchant's arrival at Ashenvale's palace, requesting urgent private audience with King Draven himself, initially drew considerable skepticism from palace guards accustomed to countless desperate petitioners claiming urgent, life-altering information deserving immediate royal attention. His persistence, combined with careful, specific details regarding exactly what he claimed to have discovered, eventually earned him the audience he sought. Draven, now considerably more cautious and weathered by 11 years of ruling following Cala's devastating disappearance, meeting the merchant with careful, guarded skepticism rather than the desperate hope such claims might once have immediately provoked. "You claim to have found evidence of Lady Rivers," Draven said, studying the merchant with careful assessment. "I've received countless similar claims over the years, each one ultimately proving false. What makes your particular information credible?" "A healer in a border village called Hollow Creek," the merchant said, providing careful, specific detail regarding the location and circumstances of his encounter. Storm gray eyes, precisely as several older palace descriptions of Lady Rivers detailed. "And a son, Your Majesty, approximately 11 years old, bearing a scar behind his left ear shaped precisely like the ashen royal crest." The description struck Draven with devastating, immediate force. Details considerably too specific, too precisely aligned with information the merchant had no obvious way of independently fabricating for casual dismissal as simple opportunistic fraud. "Continue," Draven said, voice carefully controlled despite the sudden, overwhelming hope threatening to overwhelm 11 years of careful, protective emotional distance he'd maintained regarding Cala's devastating disappearance. The merchant provided every remaining detail he'd carefully gathered throughout his days of medical treatment within Hollow Creek, Corin's evident medical training, his unusual precision and skill for someone so young, subtle physical details that, cumulatively, painted an increasingly convincing picture of exactly the discovery Draven had spent 11 devastating years desperately hoping, and gradually, painfully giving up hope, of ever achieving. "I need this location confirmed," Draven said, once the merchant's account had concluded, already calling for his most trusted advisors to begin immediate, careful preparation for what he understood might prove either devastating disappointment or the single most significant discovery of his entire reign. "And I need absolute discretion regarding this investigation until I understand precisely what we're actually dealing with." Word of the merchant's claim reached Queen Mother Isabeau within hours, her carefully maintained composure cracking, for the first time in 11 years, with genuine, dawning horror as she understood exactly how thoroughly her decade-old calculated deception now stood at genuine risk of complete, catastrophic exposure. She summoned her most trusted advisor within the hour, understanding with devastating clarity that whatever careful manipulation she'd once employed to protect Ashenvale's throne now required considerably more urgent, decisive action to prevent her own catastrophic role in Cala's original disappearance from ever reaching her son's devastating understanding. The merchant's arrival at Ashenvale's palace, requesting urgent private audience with King Draven himself, initially drew considerable skepticism from palace guards accustomed to countless desperate petitioners claiming urgent, life-altering information deserving immediate royal attention. His persistence, combined with careful, specific details regarding exactly what he claimed to have discovered, eventually earned him the audience he sought. Draven, now considerably more cautious and weathered by 11 years of ruling following Cala's devastating disappearance, meeting the merchant with careful, guarded skepticism rather than the desperate hope such claims might once have immediately provoked. "You claim to have found evidence of Lady Rivers," Draven said, studying the merchant with careful assessment. "I've received countless similar claims over the years, each one ultimately proving false. What makes your particular information credible?" "A healer in a border village called Hollow Creek," the merchant said, providing careful, specific detail regarding the location and circumstances of his encounter. Storm gray eyes, precisely as several older palace descriptions of Lady Rivers detailed. And a son, Your Majesty, approximately 11 years old, bearing a scar behind his left ear shaped precisely like the ashen royal crest. The description struck Draven with devastating, immediate force. Details considerably too specific, too precisely aligned with information the merchant had no obvious way of independently fabricating for casual dismissal as simple opportunistic fraud. Continue, Draven said, voice carefully controlled despite the sudden, overwhelming hope threatening to overwhelm 11 years of careful, protective emotional distance he'd maintained regarding Kala's devastating disappearance. The merchant provided every remaining detail he'd carefully gathered throughout his days of medical treatment within Hollow Creek, Corrin's evident medical training, his unusual precision and skill for someone so young, subtle physical details that, cumulatively, painted an increasingly convincing picture of exactly the discovery Draven had spent 11 devastating years desperately hoping, and gradually, painfully giving up hope, of ever achieving. I need this location confirmed, Draven said, once the merchant's account had concluded, already calling for his most trusted advisors to begin immediate, careful preparation for what he understood might prove either devastating disappointment or the single most significant discovery of his entire reign. And I need absolute discretion regarding this investigation until I understand precisely what we're actually dealing with. Word of the merchant's claim reached Queen Mother Isabeau within hours, her carefully maintained composure cracking, for the first time in 11 years, with genuine, dawning horror as she understood exactly how thoroughly her decade-old calculated deception now stood at genuine risk of complete, catastrophic exposure. She summoned her most trusted advisor within the hour, understanding with devastating clarity that whatever careful manipulation she'd once employed to protect Ashenvale's throne now required considerably more urgent, decisive action to prevent her own catastrophic role in Kala's original disappearance from ever reaching her son's devastating understanding. Isabeau's desperate attempts to intercept Draven's investigation before it could reach Hollow Creek proved, ultimately, considerably less successful than her original decade-old manipulation had once achieved. Send additional guards to secure the northern border passages, she instructed her advisor, urgency barely concealed beneath her carefully maintained composure. I want any travel toward the border territories Draven's investigation might target delayed as thoroughly as diplomatically possible, without revealing my own direct involvement in that delay. Her advisor, loyal but genuinely troubled by the increasingly desperate nature of instructions that suggested considerably more devastating history than Isabeau had ever previously disclosed, hesitated before finally voicing careful, concerned questions. Your Majesty, if I may ask, what precisely are we attempting to prevent King Draven from discovering? That doesn't concern you, Isabeau said, sharper than she'd intended, old guilt and desperate fear tangling together into uncharacteristic harshness. Simply ensure the delays are implemented immediately. Her efforts, though genuinely attempted, ultimately proved insufficient against Draven's own increasingly urgent, personally directed investigation. He rode south within 2 days of the merchant's initial revelation, refusing to wait for his mother's careful, unexplained bureaucratic delays to resolve whatever administrative obstacles had suddenly, suspiciously begun appearing throughout his preparation. Something isn't right about these delays, he confided to his most trusted general, General Aldrich Thorne, during their journey south. My mother has never previously shown particular interest in border territory administrative matters. This sudden, urgent concern regarding Northern Passage security feels considerably too convenient, given the timing. You suspect her involvement in something beyond simple coincidence, Your Majesty? I don't know what to suspect, Draven admitted. 11 years of carefully suppressed grief and growing, uncomfortable suspicion finally surfacing into genuine, articulated doubt. But I intend to understand precisely what happened 11 years ago, General. Whatever the answer ultimately proves, I refuse to continue accepting my mother's careful, convenient explanations without proper, independent verification. They arrived at Hollow Creek's border territory 4 days after departing the capital, considerably faster than Isabeau's desperate delaying tactics had anticipated, guided by the merchant's careful directions toward the remote village's genuinely difficult-to-locate position. Draven felt the mate bond's unmistakable pull the moment he crossed into the village's outer perimeter. 11 years of careful, devastating suppression suddenly, overwhelmingly breaking apart entirely at the unmistakable, undeniable confirmation that Calla remained genuinely, impossibly alive. He found her in the village's small medical cottage, treating a minor injury with the same careful, dedicated skill he remembered from 11 years earlier, and beside her, assisting with practiced, familiar precision, a boy whose storm-gray eyes and unmistakable ashen features struck Draven with devastating, overwhelming force. Calla looked up at his entrance, and 11 years of careful, protective distance shattered entirely in a single, overwhelming moment of mutual, devastating recognition. Neither of them spoke for several long, suspended moments, the small medical cottage's ordinary afternoon activities fading entirely into irrelevant background noise against the overwhelming weight of 11 years' worth of unspoken devastation finally, unavoidably colliding. Draven. Calla's voice, when she finally managed to speak, carried a complicated tangle of shock, old grief, and cautious, disbelieving hope that mirrored, precisely, everything churning within Draven's own overwhelmed emotional state. "You're alive," he said, the words barely adequate to capture 11 years of devastating uncertainty finally, impossibly resolving into undeniable, physical confirmation. "Calla, I searched everywhere. For years. I never stopped believing. My mother told everyone I chose to abandon you," Calla said, understanding immediately, with devastating clarity, exactly what careful narrative Isabeau had constructed to explain her sudden, inexplicable disappearance. "That's what she told you, isn't it? That I simply left, without genuine reason, abandoning both you and our child," she suggested. Draven said slowly, old suspicion finally crystallizing into devastating, undeniable certainty that perhaps you'd never genuinely intended permanent commitment to our bond in the first place. I spent years unable to fully reconcile that suggestion against everything I remembered of our actual relationship, but grief made it difficult to consider alternative explanations objectively. "She threatened me," Calla said, the truth finally, after 11 years of careful protective silence, pouring loose with devastating, overwhelming force. "The physicians discovered my family's connection to the Thornwood bloodline, buried 3 generations deep but genetically undeniable. Your mother made clear that continuing the pregnancy within Ashenvale's borders would result in my execution for treason, and our child's permanent removal to prevent any dangerous claim on your throne's legitimacy." The revelation struck Draven with devastating, overwhelming force. 11 years of careful, calculated maternal manipulation suddenly, catastrophically exposed in its full, devastating scope. "She threatened to kill you," he said, voice breaking with a fury he'd rarely experienced throughout his entire reign. "And to take our child. She let me believe you'd simply abandoned us, rather than admitting she'd forced you into impossible, devastating exile to protect the kingdom's political stability." Corin, watching this overwhelming exchange with growing, confused understanding, finally stepped forward with the same careful, curious directness Calla recognized as entirely his own, despite 11 years of careful separation from any genuine paternal influence. "Are you my father?" he asked, storm-gray eyes meeting an identical pair with a recognition that struck Draven with fresh, overwhelming emotion. "Yes," Draven said, kneeling slowly to meet his son's eye level. 11 years of devastating loss finally, impossibly resolving into overwhelming, undeniable presence. And I am so profoundly sorry it's taken this long for us to finally meet. Corin studied him with grave, careful assessment, considerably more mature and measured than most 11-year-olds might manage under such overwhelming circumstances. Mom said my father was probably dead, he said finally. Or that maybe he just didn't want us. I didn't really believe either explanation, if I'm honest. But I never expected you'd actually be a king. I'm considerably more interested, Draven said, in being your father than in whatever royal title accompanies that responsibility. Though I understand, Corin, that being my son carries certain complicated implications we'll need to carefully navigate together going forward. He turned back to Calla, 11 years of devastating separation finally, overwhelmingly giving way to fierce, protective resolve. My mother's manipulation ends today, he said. Whatever it costs politically, whatever complications the Thornwood bloodline revelation ultimately creates, I refuse to allow her calculated deception to continue costing either of you a single additional day of unnecessary, devastating exile. The journey back to Ashenvale's capital carried a complicated mixture of overwhelming joy and devastating, unresolved fury. Draven determined to formally confront his mother's decade-old deception before Calla, and Corin's continued safety could be genuinely guaranteed within the kingdom's borders. He summoned Isabeau to a private audience immediately upon their arrival, refusing his mother's careful attempts to delay the confrontation with various urgent administrative concerns she claimed required her immediate attention. Draven, Isabeau began. The moment their private audience commenced, her carefully composed expression already betraying genuine, dawning alarm at the fury evident in her son's controlled but unmistakably furious demeanor. I understand you've located Lady Rivers. I want you to know how genuinely relieved I am that. Don't, Draven interrupted, voice cold with a controlled fury Isabeau had rarely witnessed throughout his entire reign. I know the truth, Mother. About the Thornwood bloodline. About your threats. About 11 years of allowing me to believe Calla simply abandoned me, rather than admitting your own calculated role in her devastating, forced exile. Isabeau's careful composure finally, completely shattered, old guilt and desperate, calculated justification warring visibly behind her suddenly ashen expression. I did what was necessary to protect this kingdom's stability, she said, though her voice carried considerably less conviction than her original decade-old manipulation had once demonstrated. The Thornwood connection posed genuine, existential threat to Ashenvale's legitimacy, Draven. I couldn't allow personal sentiment to jeopardize 11 generations of. You could have told me the truth, Draven said, fury cracking through his careful control. You could have trusted me to navigate that political complexity honestly, rather than manufacturing an elaborate, devastating lie that cost me 11 years with the woman I loved, and 11 years I'll never recover with my own son. Would you have chosen the kingdom's stability over her, given honest disclosure of the actual danger? Isabeau asked, old calculated reasoning still evident beneath her genuine, dawning guilt. Or would you have simply insisted on keeping her regardless, exposing this kingdom to the same rebellious instability that nearly destroyed our line a century ago? I don't know, Draven admitted, old grief tangling with fresh, overwhelming fury. But that choice should have been mine to make, Mother. Not yours to manipulate through calculated deception and devastating threats against an innocent woman's life. He formally stripped Isabeau of her remaining political influence within the palace that same day, allowing her continued residence within Ashenvale's borders, but removing any genuine authority over succession matters or council decisions, a punishment considerably more merciful than her original threats against Calla had once demanded, though delivered with a cold, unwavering finality that left no room for the kind of manipulative reconciliation Isabeau might once have attempted. He then turned his full attention toward formally, publicly addressing the Thornwood bloodline revelation before Ashenvale's assembled council, understanding, with hard-won clarity, that continued secrecy regarding Corin's true heritage would only perpetuate exactly the kind of devastating vulnerability his mother's original manipulation had claimed to prevent. The formal council session, convened 3 days after Draven's confrontation with his mother, brought Ashenvale's assembled nobility face to face with a revelation considerably more complicated than any political crisis the kingdom had faced throughout its 11-generation history. 11 years ago, Draven addressed the assembled council, Calla and Corin present at his specific, deliberate insistence. My mother discovered that my bonded mate, Lady Calla Rivers, carried genetic connection to the Thornwood bloodline, exiled from this kingdom a century ago. Rather than disclosing this discovery to me directly, she threatened Lady Rivers with execution and forced separation from our unborn child, driving her into devastating, unnecessary exile that has cost all 3 of us 11 years we can never recover. Murmurs of genuine shock swept through the assembled council, several older nobles exchanging alarmed glances at the implications this revelation carried for the kingdom's entire understanding of succession legitimacy and political stability. I understand, Draven continued, that this revelation raises genuine, legitimate questions regarding my son Corin's position within our succession tradition. I don't intend to dismiss those concerns as irrelevant, but I do intend to address them honestly, through careful, transparent deliberation, rather than through the kind of calculated, devastating secrecy my mother once employed. Elder Vasquez, the council's oldest and most respected member, rose to address the assembled nobility directly. Your Majesty, the Thornwood Rebellion occurred a full century ago. I would ask this council to consider carefully whether a genetic connection buried 3 generations deep genuinely warrants the same catastrophic concern our ancestors once applied to active rebellion, or whether continued adherence to that century-old fear serves this kingdom's genuine interests any longer. The debate that followed extended across several formal council sessions, careful historical research eventually confirming that the original Thornwood Rebellion's specific concerns, territorial disputes, and succession claims that had motivated the original conflict held little genuine relevance to a modern kingdom that had, over the intervening century, resolved most of the underlying political tensions that had originally sparked the rebellion. I would propose, Elder Vasquez eventually suggested, that this council formally recognize young Corin's legitimate position as Prince of Ashenvale, understanding that his Thornwood connection reflects historical circumstance rather than genuine, ongoing political threat to this kingdom's stability. The formal vote, conducted 3 weeks after Draven's initial revelation, confirmed Corin's legitimate royal status, with considerably more unanimous support than Isabeau's original, calculated fear had ever anticipated possible, a resolution that finally, completely validated Draven's fierce, unwavering insistence that honest, transparent confrontation of difficult political complexity ultimately served Ashenvale's genuine interests considerably better than his mother's decade of devastating, calculated secrecy. Calla, watching this formal proceedings unfold with cautious, overwhelming relief, finally allowed herself to believe that 11 years of careful, protective exile had genuinely reached its conclusion. The formal ceremony welcoming Calla and Corin back into Ashenvale's royal court took place beneath a full moon 3 months after their initial, overwhelming reunion, a considerably more intimate ceremony than the elaborate political spectacle that might once have accompanied a royal mate's formal recognition, though no less significant for its more deliberate, carefully considered pacing. Corin, now formally recognized as Ashenvale's crown prince, had spent the preceding months gradually adjusting to a life considerably different from Hollow Creek's quiet, remote simplicity, palace tutors, formal ceremonial training, and the complicated, overwhelming reality of suddenly belonging to a kingdom he'd spent 11 years entirely unaware even existed as part of his genuine heritage. "Do you miss Hollow Creek?" Draven asked him, one evening several months into their continued reunion, watching his son navigate an increasingly complex formal court dinner with careful, developing confidence. "Sometimes," Corrin admitted honestly. "It was simpler there. But I like learning about all of this too. And Petra says she'll visit sometimes, now that it's safe for people to know where we actually are." Calla, meanwhile, had gradually rebuilt her relationship with Draven through careful, deliberate reconciliation, 11 years of separation requiring considerably more patient, honest rebuilding than either of them had initially anticipated when their overwhelming reunion first occurred. "I don't blame you for what my mother did," Draven told her, months into their careful reconciliation, both of them sitting together in the palace gardens where their original courtship had once flourished, 11 years and a lifetime of devastating complications earlier. "But I understand if trust requires considerable additional time to genuinely rebuild, given everything her manipulation cost us both." "I've had 11 years to process my own grief regarding what happened," Calla said. "I don't think I ever genuinely blamed you, Draven. I understood, even then, that your mother's manipulation deliberately prevented you from ever having the chance to make an honest, informed choice. But rebuilding genuine trust after everything, I think that's something we'll need to build carefully, deliberately, rather than simply assuming 11 years apart hasn't fundamentally changed both of us." "I would want nothing less," Draven said, "than genuine, deliberate rebuilding, rather than simply assuming our original bond alone guarantees everything we've lost can be instantly restored." Their formal reunion ceremony, when it finally occurred, reflected exactly this hard-won, deliberate approach, not a hurried restoration of what had been stolen, but a genuine, careful new beginning built on 11 years' worth of hard-earned wisdom regarding exactly what authentic partnership actually required. Isabeau, present at the ceremony despite her diminished political standing, watched from a respectful distance, old guilt and gradual, hard-won understanding regarding her own catastrophic manipulations genuine cost evident in her considerably humbled demeanor. "I know I can never fully undo the damage I caused," she told Calla privately, following the formal ceremony's conclusion, in the first genuine, unguarded conversation the two women had shared since Isabeau's original devastating threat 11 years earlier. "But I hope, in time, you might allow me the chance to know my grandson properly and to demonstrate, through consistent action rather than empty words, genuine remorse for the devastating pain my calculated fear once caused you both." "Time," Calla said carefully, "will determine whether that's genuinely possible. I won't promise instant forgiveness, Isabeau. But I also won't prevent Corrin from forming his own judgment regarding his grandmother, provided your continued actions genuinely reflect the remorse you're claiming." Above the palace that evening, the full moon rose bright and clear over a kingdom finally, genuinely reckoning with 11 years of devastating, calculated secrecy, and Draven Ashen, watching his son and Calla together beneath that same moonlight that had once, so many years earlier, confirmed their genuine, undeniable bond, understood exactly how precious hard-won, honestly rebuilt love truly proved to be. The end.